Hi everyone, I hope you're all well. Or should I have said hi ladies? I'm afraid if you're a man you have to turn this off right now. This little Bible teaching video is just for the Westkirk women. And I know it's weird, you're used to looking at Dave and Peter on these videos and I'm definitely not used to looking at a camera, but hopefully it won't be too long before we can be together again and maybe do something like this in person. That would be really great. But for the next few weeks, we are going to be going through the book of James. But who is James and why are we going to study the book? Or maybe a better question is, who is James and who will we become once we finish this study? Well, you've guessed it, James was written by James, which sounds like a really smart guess, but actually there's about 5,000 Jameses in the New Testament, and I won't go through all the contenders now. I've done the hard work for you, but this James is James, the half-brother of Jesus, Mary and Joseph's other son, and he became the leader of the very first church in Jerusalem after Peter moved on to plant churches elsewhere. So we're talking the very first Christian community ever. I don't know what minister wants to pastor a church full of brand new Christians, never mind the first Christian church ever. But James was the man for the job. They actually called him James the Just as a nickname, so he was a really respected leader. He was that guy that everyone looked to see how he was doing it in his church. And when he addresses his letter to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, he's talking to the first Jewish Christians who had dispersed, who fled for their lives because the Jews wanted them dead, or I should have said the Jewish leaders wanted them dead. And James is writing this letter to them as they face persecution, and he wants to show them what real and genuine faith looks like. James isn't teaching them new theological ideas like Paul is in his letters. He doesn't leave his readers scratching his head or looking up words and wondering what they mean. James is very straight to the point. James wants to get all up in your business and challenge how you live. And you know, when people go to places like Turkey or I don't know where else, and they bring back knockoff handbags and shoes and football shirts, there's telltale signs, or people say there's telltale signs to whether they're real or fake. Well, James is going to show us the telltale signs of real and genuine faith. And James's aim is that his readers would serve Jesus more wholeheartedly and radically too. So while it's the perfect book for a new Christian, because it's so practical and straight to the point, it's also the perfect book for a Christian who's been on that journey a little bit longer, because 2020 and now 2021 is begging for us to take our eyes off Jesus. It's begging for us to take our eyes off the one who gives us hope. It's begging for us to pack it in. The world is begging for us to give up on Jesus. We've even had to stop worshipping together, and the enemy really wants us to enjoy being cozy on our sofas. He would much rather we get used to being cozy than getting serious about Christ. We've had to stop outreach. We've had to stop having fellowship together as brothers and sisters. It's been nearly a year since I've hugged any of you, and I really need a hug. And if ever there was a time to go a bit meh about your faith, or to go a bit stale, or to just drift along and let our relationships with God just drift, then this is the time. But let's not let this be it, because in the book of James, God calls us to more, and he calls us to live for Jesus with everything that we have, because he is so worth it. So let's read the first little chunk of James 1, verses 1 to 18. It's quite long, but I'll try and go quite quick. So James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to To the 12 tribes scattered among the nations, greetings. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they pass away like a wild flower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant, its blossoms fall, and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of firstfruits of all he created. I have a question for all of you ladies. Have you ever looked at another woman and thought to yourself, I wish I was her, she seems to have it so easy, or I wish I was her, she seems to have it all sorted out? We've all done it, and I think the greatest illusion in this life is that other people don't suffer and that other people have it all together. But if we were together right now and we all shared one area of trial or temptation in our lives, we'd be here for hours. And the original readers of James's letter knew trials. You know trials. James himself knew trials. When the Jewish leaders wanted James dead, they couldn't even wait long enough for a stoning sentence. So a mob carried him to the top of a temple tower and threw him down, but he didn't die, so they stoned him, and he still didn't die, so someone came ahead and finished off the job with a club, and they beat him across the head. Absolutely brutal. So everyone goes through trials of various kinds, and what is the one thing everyone asks? Why? That's what we all ask when we are suffering. Why is this happening? Well, James actually gives us the answer to that question in this passage. Of course, we know it's because of what happened at the fall. Sin entered into the world and things no longer work like they should. We make mistakes, others make mistakes, our bodies don't work like they should. We don't look after our bodies like we should. But there's also another answer to the why question. Trials produce something bigger in us, by God's grace, of course. Trials grow our faith. They make us become like Jesus, they make us rely on Jesus, and they make us long for Jesus. What do trials produce in the life of someone who doesn't love the Lord? Well, just look around. It produces hopelessness, devastation, depression, anger. But in a woman who loves the Lord, trials are fertile soil for fruitful growth, and they can push us to a real and genuine faith. And in this passage, James is going to show us how trials of various kinds produce faith of various kinds. And there will be three kinds that we see: a mature faith, a single-minded faith, and a persevering faith, which doesn't make much sense now, but I promise it will. So starting in verses 2 to 4, we see that trials produce a mature faith. And James says, the testing of your faith will make you mature and complete. But wait, first of all, he says, consider it pure joy. And I freaked out when I read this because some of you listening to this, I know, have been through trials beyond my wildest imagination. And I didn't want to sit here as a 25-year-old and tell you to consider it pure joy. But thankfully, that isn't what James is saying here. He's not saying you must be joyful or feel joy no matter what is going on in your life. Or you must suck it up and just say, oh, that's just life, we have to get on with it. That's a very Northern Irish thing to do, but thankfully God isn't Northern Irish. God knows the pain of the suffering we're going through, and he gives us permission to cry out to him and feel the pain. And you don't have to be joyful, but you can know that you can have joy knowing that this trial is part of a faithful work to grow you in faithfulness, and the goal is your godliness at the end. James says, the testing of your faith will make you mature and complete. The testing of your faith. We tend to think of tests in a really negative way because, well, we started doing them at school. And at school, when you do a test, your teacher is testing your knowledge and testing you to see what you don't know about maths or English or geography or something else you'll never use until you're homeschooling your 7-year-old. You're being tested to see where you're lacking. But God isn't the big bad teacher who wants to trip us up. He is a loving Father who is utterly good in every way, and he will not let us go through or face a test that will bring us to ruin. He only allows us to face a test that will bring us good. He's a Father who has saved us and made us secure, and we are shielded by him. But sometimes his definition of good is very different to our definition of good. And while he's a good father, he's not a father who stands and smiles and nods approvingly at every single choice we make. He pays attention to whether our actions are those of holy people who have been set apart for his purposes. And he allows our faith to be tested so that we will be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And the ESV version of the Bible actually says perfect and complete instead of mature and complete. And when I read the word perfect, I realized God is so much more ambitious for me than I am for myself. I am settling for so much less. When I think about growing in my faith, I think I want to be a little less lazy, a little less selfish. I'd like to have a little more zeal. I'd like to have a little less temper. But Jesus wants me perfect. And sometimes the only way he can work that into me is through trials, because they stretch my faith and they grow my character. Did you know that birds tip their babies out of the nest when they're teaching them to fly? I didn't know that, and I thought it was quite savage. But it's the same way that we as mothers or carers can't just jump in every time our children are facing something hard. We can't just remove every obstacle from their path, because then they would never mature. But we do let them know that we are there for them and they can come to us. And in the same way, God shows us that even when our faith is being tested and we face trials, he is loving and trustworthy. And because he is loving and trustworthy and infinitely good, then we can have joy knowing that our trials will make us more like him and grow to a mature faith. And then in the second section, in verses 5-7, where James shows us that trials produce a single-minded faith. So he's shown us that trials produce a mature faith, and now he's showing us that trials produce a single-minded faith. A single-minded faith is one where we turn from ourselves and we turn to God. And maybe your trial of various kinds is just not knowing. It's not knowing what the future holds or when your struggle will end or what God is up to, and you find yourself just saying, why, or when. James tells us here to turn our request for why into a request for wisdom. Turn to God and stop relying on yourself. He says, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. So if God never rejects a request for wisdom, then why aren't there a lot more wise people running around? No, because when we're in a trial, what do? We ask God to get us out of the trial, and then when he doesn't get us out of the trial, we ask him to tell us what to do. So we say, just get me out of this, or tell me what to do. That's us asking for knowledge instead of wisdom. And there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is facts, whereas wisdom is the ability to understand and know what to do with the facts that are in front of us. It's like how we teach our children. When we are teaching our children, we teach them the facts, but then they need to discern between the good choice and the bad choice. There's no point telling them what to do all the time because they'll never learn that ability for themselves. That's wisdom. And here it says that all we have to do is ask God for wisdom and it will be given to us. It's really that simple. He gives it without finding fault, which means he'll never be irritated or say, I gave you a head, why don't you use it? Or what did you do with the last wisdom I gave you? Did you even thank me? No, his answer is always, I'm so glad you asked. Here it comes. Instead of saying, why me? We should ask God for that which he has promised to give us. And the only condition is that we believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. So a double-minded man or woman is one who doubts and is out of control, tossed about on a wild ride to nowhere. It's almost as if they are double-souled and they flip between God's ways and the world's ways. Whereas a single-minded woman has one focus, and that focus is God. Like an archer with a bow and an arrow, the focus is on the bullseye. He's not saying we can never doubt God, never ever. This is talking about someone who thinks they don't need wisdom, or worse, thinks they don't need God. And that's essentially what we're saying when we don't turn to God in a trial. That's what we're saying when we keep relying on ourselves, on ourselves instead of him. And in verses 9 to 11, James mentions another kind of trial that will produce a single-minded faith, the trial of blessing. And I know that sounds bizarre and you're probably thinking, well, Rebecca, I wouldn't mind the trial of blessing if you had seen what I'm going through now. But the truth is, the trial of blessing will also either drive us to faith or drive us from it. And James emphasizes that the riches of this world will pass away like a wild flower. The rich will fade away. And let's be honest, nothing makes us pray more than when we have no money, when we can't pay bills, and when we genuinely can't buy groceries. It's much easier to turn to God in utter dependence when we have nothing and nowhere else to go. It's much harder to acknowledge our need when life is comfortable and cushy. It's much harder for the rich to present themselves as a humble, naked beggar before the Lord. So whether our trials are blessing or suffering, let's be single-minded people of faith who turn to God, who ask for wisdom, and who know our need for him. And thirdly and finally, in verse 12, James shows us that trials produce a persevering faith. And what are we persevering towards? The crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. What a promise! This passage starts with trials and it ends with a crown. Here, James wants to lift our perspective from the perishable to the permanent, from the perishable trials of this life to the permanent joy that lies ahead of us. Eternal joy and eternal riches are coming, but until then we must persevere, because just as our King didn't wear a crown in this life, we won't either. But what is perseverance? Well, perseverance isn't sticking your head in the sand and just thinking, I need to hunker down till I get through this. Perseverance is a determined act of the will to rely on Jesus. And you can only do that with your eyes fixed on him. And how do we know how to persevere? Well, God perseveres towards us. He shows us best. He never grows weary in loving us or showing us grace and forgiveness. He never wavers. He is a steadfast Father. The most obvious, maybe it's just obvious to me, the most obvious example of perseverance is in labour and childbirth. And if you've never given birth, I'm sure you've heard a very detailed story of someone else who has given birth, because there seems to be an unwritten rule that we can share all the details of those stories, whether people want to hear them or not. And in labour, we all reach a stage where we don't think we're going to make it. And apparently it's called the transition stage, and it's just before the baby is about to make his appearance. And women scream they can't do it, and it's normally when they ask for an epidural and they think they're going to die and they can't go on. But they do go on. They continue with the hard work of labour and they persevere, because they know that the pain won't last forever and there's joy on the other side. And if the promises of God are true, then on the other side of this limited period of suffering on earth, there is great joy set before us. There is a crown of life. The whole way through this passage, you could say that James is showing us that trials make us become like Jesus, rely on Jesus, and long for Jesus. But in verse 13, he warns that trials tempt us to turn from Jesus and blame him. But it says, God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. Temptation is another trial of various kinds. And it's funny how if we're not blaming God, then we're blaming Satan for our temptation. And these verses remind us that our flesh is just as present and deadly as the enemy outside of us. That's why we need to be vigilant. And don't be deceived that good things come from anywhere else but God. It warns us that in seasons of suffering, we are tempted to forget how good he is. But look at how he's described in verses 16 to 18 to finish. It says he's the Father of heavenly lights. That means he is sovereign and he reigns over every corner of this universe he's created, and yet he still cares about us and somehow is still interested in us. It says he does not change like shifting shadows. So that means he is dependable, he is unchanging and constant. His commitment to us never changes. And it says he chose to give new birth, so he is so gracious. His greatest gift to all of us is new birth in our hearts, and that's just the beginning of his plan to make all things new. This is the God we cling to through trials, the God who is powerfully, dependably, and graciously good. This is the God who is using our trials to grow our faith and to make it real and genuine.